You check your bank statement on a Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, and something catches your eye. Netflix, $14.99. Spotify, $10.99. Adobe Creative Cloud, $54.99. Microsoft 365, $9.99. iCloud Storage, $2.99. YouTube Premium, $13.99. Your Gyms app, $29.99. That meditation app you forgot about, $12.99. The cloud backup service, $11.99. Your car's connected services, $25. The smart home security subscription, $14.99. Disney Plus, because the kids insisted, $13.99. You do the math, $247 every single month. And that's before you remember the Amazon Prime membership and the meal kit service. Here's what hits you as you stare at that number. You're not buying anything. Nothing on that list will ever be yours. Cancel the payment. Lose the access. Every single one of these services is a perpetual lease on functionality that 2 decades ago you would have simply purchased and owned. Your parents bought albums. You rent access to a music library that can change without warning. Your father bought Microsoft Office on a CD for $200 and used it for a decade. You pay $10 a month forever, and after 10 years you've spent $1,200 and own nothing. Your grandfather bought a car with heated seats, and those seats stayed heated until the car died. You bought a car with heated seats, but they won't turn on unless you pay the monthly fee. This is the moment of awakening. It usually happens quietly, often when you're doing something mundane like reviewing your finances or trying to figure out why your paycheck doesn't stretch as far as it should. You make more money than your parents did at your age, inflation adjusted. You might even make more than your grandparents made in their entire careers. But somehow, you own less. You have less security. You feel poorer. And the most disturbing part is that this feeling is completely accurate. The corporate messaging told you this would be liberating. Access over ownership, they said. Why burden yourself with the responsibility of ownership when you could have the freedom of access? Pay a small monthly fee and get everything you need without the hassle of maintenance, storage, or obsolescence. It sounded reasonable. It sounded modern. It sounded like progress. No more shelves full of CDs gathering dust. No more software that becomes outdated. No more being locked into old technology. Just seamless access to everything, everywhere, updated constantly, curated perfectly for you. But here's what they didn't tell you in those sleek marketing campaigns with minimalist design and promises of simplicity. They didn't tell you that you were participating in the largest transfer of wealth and economic power in modern history. They didn't tell you that every time you clicked subscribe instead of purchase, you were surrendering a piece of economic sovereignty that previous generations fought and died to secure. They didn't tell you that the subscription model isn't about serving you better. It's about extracting more money from you while giving you less power, less control, and zero equity. Think about what ownership used to mean. When your grandmother bought a sewing machine, that machine was hers. She could use it for 50 years. She could modify it, repair it, or pass it down to your mother. The manufacturer had no ongoing claim on it. They couldn't reach into her home and disable features. They couldn't demand monthly payments, or the machine would stop working. She paid once, and the transaction was complete. The power dynamic was clear. She was the customer, they were the vendor, and after the sale, they had no power over her. Now think about your relationship with the software you use every day. Adobe doesn't sell you Photoshop anymore. They lease it to you. Stop paying, and your ability to even open your own work files disappears. You don't own your tools. You don't own your creative output in any meaningful sense because you can't access it without their permission. Microsoft Office, the same story. You're not buying productivity software. You're renting the ability to be productive month after month, year after year, and the price can change whenever they decide to change it. Your music collection isn't a collection at all. It's a temporary license to access Spotify's library, which changes based on licensing agreements you have no control over. Songs disappear. Albums vanish. Artists pull their catalogs. And you have no recourse because you never owned any of it. You just paid for the privilege of access. And that privilege is revocable at any time. Your grandfather's record collection, by contrast, was actually his. Those records would play until they physically degraded, which could take decades. No company could reach into his home and remove his music. He had sovereignty over his own cultural consumption. This shift happened gradually enough that most people didn't notice the pattern. First it was music. Napster and piracy made buying CDs feel obsolete, and Spotify offered a convenient solution. Then it was movies and television. Netflix made cable feel expensive and outdated, so we happily subscribed. Then it was software. Adobe and Microsoft made the transition mandatory. You literally couldn't buy their products anymore even if you wanted to. Then it was cars, with manufacturers installing hardware in your vehicle but requiring subscriptions to use it. Now it's spreading to everything. Smart home devices that require subscriptions to function. Fitness equipment that's useless without the app membership. Even coffee makers that want you to subscribe to unlock features. Each individual transition seemed reasonable in isolation. But when you zoom out and see the pattern, something much larger becomes visible. We are watching the systematic elimination of ownership as an economic category for regular people. We are watching the transformation of citizens into perpetual renters. We are watching the creation of a new economic system where corporations own all assets and individuals own nothing but debt and subscription obligations. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is stated corporate strategy. It's in the earnings calls. It's in the investor presentations. Wall Street loves subscription revenue because it's predictable. It's hard to escape, and it grows automatically through price increases. A customer who pays once is a transaction. A customer who pays forever is an asset. And you, as the subscriber, have been transformed from a customer into a revenue stream. The psychological impact of this transformation is profound and largely invisible. When you own nothing, you think differently. You plan differently. You relate to the world differently. Ownership creates a specific kind of psychological stance. Investment in the future, pride in maintenance, connection to place and things. Renting creates a different stance, transience, disposability, detachment. When everything in your life is rented, you become psychologically rented. You stop thinking like an owner and start thinking like a tenant. And tenants, historically, have never had power. Your grandfather understood this intuitively. He bought a house not just for shelter, but for security and power. That house couldn't be taken away as long as he paid the property taxes. The mortgage had an end date. After 30 years, it was his, free and clear. He could renovate it, sell it, or pass it to his children. It appreciated in value, creating wealth that could be borrowed against, invested, or used to fund retirement. The house wasn't just shelter. It was sovereignty. It was economic power. It was the foundation of middle-class stability. You, statistically speaking, will probably never own a home. And if you do, you'll pay 4 or 5 times what your grandfather paid relative to income. And you'll still be paying a mortgage in your 60s. But more likely, you'll rent. You'll pay someone else's mortgage through your rent payments. You'll build their equity while building none of your own. And when you're old and can't work, you'll still be paying rent, with no asset to sell or leverage, entirely dependent on whatever social safety net still exists. This is the world we're building, not through conscious choice, but through 1,000 small surrenders, each one seemingly reasonable, each one making life slightly more convenient in the moment, while eroding the foundation of economic independence over the long term. We're trading ownership for access. We're trading equity for convenience. We're trading power for ease. And the terms of that trade are set entirely by the corporations who benefit from it. The awakening is realizing that this trade is not in your favor. The awakening is understanding that the monthly subscription fee is not just a payment for service. It's a tribute to a new kind of economic lord. It's rent on your own life, paid to corporations that increasingly control whether you can work, communicate, travel, be entertained, or even keep your home warm in winter. The awakening is seeing that we are building a system where a small class of people own everything and everyone else owns nothing. And this system has a name. It's called feudalism. We didn't call it that before because feudalism was supposed to be a relic of medieval history, a primitive economic system that modernity had surpassed. But if you own no land, no tools, no home, no car, and no means of cultural or economic production, and you must pay rent to lords who own all of these things in order to have access to them, then what exactly is the difference? The technology is newer. The lords wear hoodies instead of crowns. But the fundamental power dynamic is unchanged. There is a class that owns assets and collects rent, and there is a class that owns nothing and pays rent. And you, unless you're very fortunate or very strategic, are in the second class. This video is about how we got here. It's about the historical, economic, and technological forces that are systematically eliminating ownership as an option for regular people. It's about what we're losing when we lose the ability to own. It's about the psychological, social, and political consequences of a population that owns nothing. And it's about whether there's any path back to an economy where ownership and the independence that comes with it is possible for anyone other than the very wealthy. Because if there isn't, then we need to stop pretending we live in a free market economy and start admitting what we're actually building, a techno-feudal system where freedom is a subscription service that can be canceled at any time. To understand what we're losing, we need to understand what ownership actually is and why it matters. We need to go back to the beginning, to the foundation of property rights themselves, and understand why every major political revolution in human history was fundamentally about who gets to own what. Because ownership isn't just about having stuff, it's about having power. And the systematic elimination of ownership is necessarily the systematic elimination of power for anyone who isn't already wealthy. That's not an accident. That's the point. Property ownership isn't a natural fact of human existence. It's a legal and social construct. And like all constructs, it had to be invented, fought for, and codified into law. The story of property rights is, in many ways, the story of human civilization itself. And understanding that story is essential to understanding what's at stake in the current transition from ownership to access. Because when you understand what property rights are and why they matter, you'll understand why their erosion is so dangerous. The concept of property rights, as we understand them today, emerged over thousands of years. But the Romans gave us the clearest early framework. Roman law divided property rights into three fundamental components: usus, fructus, and abusus. Usus meant the right to use something. Fructus meant the right to enjoy the fruits or benefits of something. Abusus meant the right to consume, destroy, or dispose of something, including selling it or giving it away. True ownership meant having all three rights. If you only had usus, you were a renter or a user, not an owner. If someone else controlled the fructus, they were extracting value from you. And if you lacked abusus, you couldn't transfer the asset or leverage its value. This framework is essential to understanding our current situation. When you subscribe to software, you have us uses, but not fructus or abusus. You can use the software, but you don't receive the benefits of ownership like appreciation or resale value, and you can't sell your access or modify the product. When you rent a home, you have limited uses, but no fructus or abusus. The landlord receives the appreciation. The landlord can sell the property. You're just paying for temporary access to shelter. The subscription economy is, in Roman legal terms, a complete severance of usus from fructus and abusus. You get to use things, but all the value flows to the owner, and you have no property rights whatsoever. The Romans understood that this mattered. Property rights weren't just about economics. They were about citizenship itself. Full Roman citizens had property rights. Non-citizens, slaves, and others had varying degrees of restricted rights. Your property rights determined your legal status, your political voice, and your social position. This wasn't arbitrary. It reflected a fundamental truth. People who own nothing have no independence, and people with no independence cannot be truly free. They are dependent on others for survival, and dependency is the opposite of liberty. This principle was forgotten during the medieval period in Europe, when feudalism replaced Roman law. Under feudalism, almost no one owned land outright, except for the king and a tiny aristocratic elite. Everyone else was a tenant, holding land in exchange for service, loyalty, and payment. Peasants worked land they didn't own, paid rent to lords, and had no legal recourse if the terms changed. This wasn't called slavery, because the peasants weren't technically property themselves, but functionally, their lives were constrained by near total economic dependence. They couldn't leave, they couldn't accumulate wealth, they couldn't rise. The social order was fixed, and property rights were the mechanism of that fixation. The rediscovery of property rights as a path to freedom came during the Enlightenment, and no one articulated it more clearly than John Locke. Locke's second treatise of government, published in 1689, made property ownership the cornerstone of natural rights and individual liberty. Locke argued that people have a natural right to own property because they own their own labor, and when you mix your labor with natural resources, you create property. This wasn't just an economic argument, it was a political one. Locke argued that the purpose of government was to protect property rights, and that legitimate government required the consent of property owners. Why did this matter so much? Because Locke understood that economic independence was the prerequisite for political independence. If you own nothing, you are dependent on someone else for survival. If you're dependent, you can't freely consent to anything because your consent is coerced by necessity. But if you own property, particularly productive property like land or tools, you can survive independently. You can say no to bad deals. You can resist tyranny. You can participate in politics as a free agent rather than as a client or dependent. Property ownership wasn't just about wealth. It was about the power to be autonomous. This idea became the foundation of the American Revolution and the American experiment in republican government. The Declaration of Independence originally echoed Locke almost exactly, with life, liberty, and property as the three inalienable rights. Jefferson changed property to the pursuit of happiness in the final draft, but the underlying principle remained. The Constitution's Fifth Amendment protects property rights explicitly. No one can be deprived of property without due process of law, and private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. The founders understood that property rights weren't a luxury. They were the foundation of freedom itself. But the American approach to property went further than just protecting existing ownership. It actively promoted widespread property ownership as a social good. In the early republic, many states had property requirements for voting. This wasn't, as modern people often assume, about excluding the poor for the sake of elitism. It was about ensuring that voters were independent, that they had a stake in society, and that they couldn't be easily manipulated or coerced by the wealthy. The logic was that if you owned no property, you might vote to seize someone else's, creating instability. But if everyone owned property, everyone had an interest in protecting property rights, creating a stable social order. Thomas Jefferson championed the ideal of the yeoman farmer as the backbone of democracy. He believed that a nation of independent small farmers, each owning their own land, would be the most stable and free society possible. These farmers would be economically self-sufficient, politically independent, and invested in the long-term health of their communities. They couldn't be bought by aristocrats or threatened by tyrants because they had their own means of survival. This vision shaped American land policy for over a century. The Homestead Act of 1862 was perhaps the most dramatic expression of this principle. The federal government gave away 160 acres of public land to anyone willing to settle it and farm it for 5 years. This wasn't charity. It was social engineering, designed to create a large class of property-owning citizens who would have a personal stake in the nation's success. Over the next several decades, the Homestead Act transferred ownership of 10% of all land in the United States to private citizens. It created opportunity and ownership on a scale never before attempted in human history. The underlying principle was clear. Widespread property ownership creates a stable, free, and prosperous society. Concentrated ownership creates aristocracy, dependency, and eventual conflict. The American experiment was, in large part, an experiment in whether a society of owners could be sustained, and for a long time, it seemed to work. By the mid-20th century, America had achieved the highest rate of property ownership in human history. The majority of families owned their homes. Many owned small businesses. Ownership was not the exclusive privilege of the elite. It was normal. Why did this matter so much? Because property ownership does something psychological and political that renting cannot do. When you own your home, you can't be evicted as long as you pay your property taxes. You have security. You have the ability to modify your environment. You can paint the walls, renovate the kitchen, plant a garden, make the space truly yours. You have pride of place. You invest in your community because you plan to stay. You care about local politics because local decisions affect your property value. You become, in a very real sense, a stakeholder in society rather than just a temporary visitor. When you own productive property like tools, equipment, or a small business, you have even more power. You have the means to generate income independently. You're not entirely dependent on an employer. You have leverage in negotiations. You have options. You can take risks because you have assets to fall back on. And perhaps most importantly, you can pass that property and the opportunities it creates to your children, giving them a foundation to build from. Property ownership creates generational momentum. It compounds over time. This is why property ownership was called the foundation of the middle class. The middle class wasn't defined primarily by income. It was defined by asset ownership. A middle-class family owned a home, probably a car, maybe some savings or small investments. They had equity. They had something to lose, which meant they had stability and status. They weren't rich, but they weren't dependent. They were economically autonomous, and that autonomy gave them dignity, political voice, and social power. Now consider what it means to own nothing. If you don't own your home, you can be evicted with relatively short notice. You have no security. You can't modify your environment without permission. You have no pride of ownership because nothing is actually yours. You don't invest in your community because you might not be there next year. You don't care as much about local politics because you're transient. If you don't own productive property, you're entirely dependent on employers. You have no leverage. You have no fallback. You take fewer risks because you can't afford to, and you have nothing to pass to your children except perhaps debt. Ownership creates stability and power. Renting creates precarity and dependence. This isn't just economic theory. This was the lived experience of feudalism, where the vast majority of people owned no land and were therefore powerless. And it's increasingly becoming the lived experience of modern America, where ownership is being systematically priced out of reach or replaced with subscription access. We're told this is progress, that ownership is an outdated concept, that access is all we need. But historically, every time a society has concentrated ownership in the hands of a small elite, while everyone else rents or leases, that society has been characterized by inequality, unfreedom, and instability. Property rights matter because power matters. The right to own property is the right to be independent. The right to use, benefit from, and dispose of property is the right to participate in the economy as an equal rather than as a supplicant. And the erosion of property rights, whether through direct confiscation or through the quiet substitution of ownership with rental, is necessarily an erosion of freedom itself. This isn't rhetoric. This is the lesson of history, repeated across cultures and centuries. When people own nothing, they are not free. The American dream wasn't just a feel-good slogan. It was a specific economic architecture built on a foundation of property ownership. And for several decades in the mid-20th century, That architecture worked remarkably well for a large portion of the American population. Understanding how it worked and why it worked is essential to understanding what we're losing as that architecture is dismantled piece by piece. The period from 1945 to 1980 represents the high water mark of widespread property ownership and middle-class prosperity in American history. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of deliberate policy choices designed to turn renters into owners and to distribute wealth more broadly than ever before. The GI Bill passed in 1944 guaranteed home loans to returning veterans with no down payment required and interest rates as low as 3%. This single piece of legislation enabled millions of families to buy homes who would never have been able to afford them otherwise. At the same time, the federal government was massively subsidizing suburban development. Levittown and similar developments offered brand new homes for around $8,000 to $10,000, roughly twice the median annual income. A family making $5,000 a year could buy a house for $10,000 with a 30-year mortgage at 4% interest. The monthly payment was about $40, less than 10% of their gross income. This wasn't just affordable, it was almost absurdly easy compared to today's standards. Let's put that in perspective. Today, the median home price in the United States is around $400,000. The median household income is around $75,000. That's a ratio of 5.3 to 1. But even that understates the problem, because interest rates are higher, and the required down payment is typically 20%, which is $80,000 that most people don't have saved. In 1960, the median home price was about $16,000, and the median household income was about $6,000, a ratio of 2.7 to 1. Houses cost less than 3 years of income. Now they cost more than 5 years of income, and that's before accounting for the down payment barrier. But it wasn't just that homes were cheaper relative to income. The entire economic structure was designed to turn homeownership into a wealth-building machine. Mortgage interest was fully tax-deductible, which meant buying a home generated immediate tax savings. Property taxes were low and often capped by law, as with California's Proposition 13 passed in 1978, which limited property tax increases to 2% per year regardless of appreciation. This meant that even as your home's value increased dramatically, your carrying costs stayed relatively flat. And increase they did. The house purchased in 1960 for $15,000 would typically be worth several $100,000 by the year 2000. Even in relatively unglamorous markets. In desirable markets, appreciation could be 10 or 20-fold. This wasn't just inflation. This was real wealth creation, driven by population growth, limited housing supply, and increasing demand. Homeowners watched their net worth grow every year, simply by living in their homes. They built equity with every mortgage payment, and that equity appreciated on top of the principal payments. It was a double compounding effect. This equity wasn't just theoretical, it was accessible. Homeowners could take out home equity loans or lines of credit, using their homes as collateral to borrow money at low interest rates for other investments, education, or business ventures. The home became not just shelter, but a financial tool, a source of liquidity and leverage that enabled economic mobility. A family could buy a house at age 30, refinance at age 45 to help pay for college, retire at 65 with the mortgage paid off, and then either sell the house to fund retirement or take out a reverse mortgage to generate income while continuing to live there. But homeownership was just one leg of the wealth-building stool. The second leg was employer-provided pensions. For much of the mid-20th century, large corporations and government employers offered defined benefit pension plans. These plans promised to pay retirees a specific percentage of their final salary for the rest of their lives. If you worked for General Motors or the post office for 30 years, you retired with a pension that might be 60 to 80% of your final salary, guaranteed for life and often with cost of living adjustments. This was transformative. It meant that workers could retire with dignity and security. They didn't have to worry about outliving their savings. Because they had a guaranteed income stream. They didn't have to depend on their children or on charity. They had economic independence in old age, which meant they had power, combined with Social Security, which was more generous relative to living costs than it is today. Retirees had a baseline standard of living that was often quite comfortable. The third leg was the absence of recurring costs. When you bought a car, you owned it. There was no subscription for heated seats or remote start. There was no monthly fee to use the navigation system. You paid for the car, and then your only ongoing costs were fuel, insurance, and maintenance. When you bought software, you owned it. Microsoft Office 97 cost $300, and you could use it for a decade if you wanted. There was no monthly fee. When you bought music or movies, you owned them. A CD cost $15 and was yours forever. This meant that discretionary income stayed discretionary. After you paid your mortgage, utilities, and basic living expenses, the rest of your income could be saved or invested. There was no subscription treadmill eating up hundreds of dollars every month. And because major purchases like cars and appliances lasted for many years, you had long periods where your only costs were maintenance, not replacement or rental. All of this added up to a wealth-building formula that worked for a huge percentage of the population. You bought a house with a low mortgage payment. You paid down that mortgage while the house appreciated. You worked for an employer who provided a pension. You bought durable goods that lasted. You saved the difference. And by the time you retired, you owned your home outright. You had a pension and Social Security, and you had some savings. You weren't rich, but you were secure. You could pass the house to your kids, giving them a foundation to build from. You had achieved the American dream. The psychological effects of this system were profound. When you owned your home, you had security. You couldn't be evicted. Your housing costs were predictable and capped. You had a sense of permanence and belonging. You invested in your community because you planned to stay. You took pride in your home and maintained it because it was yours. You had something to lose, which gave you stability and made you risk-averse in healthy ways. You weren't worried about next month's rent increase or next year's lease renewal. You were thinking in decades, not months. When you had a pension, you had security in old age. You could plan. You could retire. You didn't have to work until you died or depend on your children. You had dignity and independence. This fundamentally changed how people thought about work and aging. You put in your time, knowing there was a finish line and a reward at the end. You weren't trapped in permanent precarity. When you owned your tools and your stuff, you had autonomy. You could use your car without worrying about subscription renewals. You could use your software without worrying about companies changing terms. You could watch your movies and listen to your music without worrying about licensing agreements. You controlled your own life in small but meaningful ways. All of this created a specific kind of citizen, one who was economically independent, psychologically secure, and politically engaged. This citizen had a stake in society. They had something to protect. They voted in local elections because local decisions affected their property values. They invested in their communities because they were staying. They took care of their property because it was theirs. They planned for the future because they had a foundation to build on. This wasn't universal, of course. Racial discrimination prevented many black families from accessing these benefits. Women often couldn't get mortgages without a male co-signer. Not everyone worked for employers with pensions. The system had serious inequities, but within its reach, it created a degree of widespread prosperity and economic security that was historically unprecedented. For the first time in human history, a majority of people in a society could own property, build wealth, and retire with dignity. And then it started to fall apart. Not all at once. Not obviously, but piece by piece. The architecture that made the American dream possible was dismantled, and in its place, a new architecture emerged. One built not on ownership, but on access, not on equity, but on rent, not on independence, but on dependence. The transition didn't happen because of a single decision or a single villain. It happened because of technological change, financial innovation, and the relentless logic of maximizing corporate profits. But the result is unmistakable. The American dream is dying, and subscription serfdom is taking its place. The software industry pioneered the subscription model, and understanding how and why they did it is essential to understanding the larger transformation. Because software was the test case, it proved that you could eliminate ownership, extract more money over time, and face minimal customer resistance. Once that model proved successful, it spread to every other industry. In the beginning, software was sold like any other product. You went to a store, bought a box with discs inside, took it home, installed it, and it was yours. Microsoft Windows 95 cost $210 at launch. Microsoft Office 97 cost around $300. Adobe Photoshop 5.5 cost $900. These were substantial upfront costs, but they were one-time purchases. You owned the software. You could use it for as long as your computer could run it, which could be a decade or more. This created problems for software companies. The biggest problem was the version skip. If you bought Office 97 and it did everything you needed, why would you buy Office 2000 or Office 2003? Companies spent millions developing new versions, but customers often skipped multiple versions because the old one still worked fine. This meant unpredictable revenue. Some years were great when a killer new version came out. Other years were terrible when customers decided the new features weren't worth the upgrade cost. The second problem was piracy. Software could be copied infinitely at zero cost. One person bought Photoshop, and 10 friends installed it from the same disk. Companies tried various copy protection schemes, but determined pirates could crack anything. The business model of selling software as a product had a fundamental vulnerability. The product could be replicated without the company receiving payment. The third problem was the used market. If you bought Office 97 and later decided you didn't need it, you could sell it on eBay. Someone else got a legal copy and Microsoft got nothing. This wasn't as big a problem as piracy, but it meant that the total addressable market was limited. Once someone owned a copy, they were out of the market unless they decided to upgrade. The industry needed a new model, and the emergence of broadband internet provided it. If software lived in the cloud rather than on your computer, if it required constant internet connection and authentication, if your files were stored on company servers rather than your hard drive, then the company could control access completely. You couldn't pirate it because you never possessed it. You couldn't resell it because there was nothing to sell. And you couldn't skip versions because there were no versions, just continuous updates to the service. Salesforce was the pioneer. Founded in 1999, Salesforce offered customer relationship management software entirely through a web browser. You didn't install anything. You just logged in, paid a monthly fee, and used their tools. If you stopped paying, you lost access. Your data was on their servers, so you were locked in. Switching to a competitor meant migrating all your data and retraining your entire team, which was expensive and risky. This created enormous customer lifetime value. Once someone subscribed, they tended to stay subscribed for years. Netflix proved the model worked for consumers, not just businesses. In 2007, Netflix shifted from DVD rentals to streaming. For $8 a month, you got unlimited access to their library. It seemed like an incredible deal compared to buying DVDs at $20 each or renting them at $5 per movie. But here's what people didn't fully appreciate at the time. You weren't building a collection. You were renting access to Netflix's collection, which could change without notice. Movies and shows appeared and disappeared based on licensing deals. Your $8 bought you nothing permanent. It bought you this month's access. Adobe was the turning point for professional software. In 2013, Adobe announced that they would no longer sell Creative Suite as a product. Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, and the rest of their professional tools would only be available through Creative Cloud subscription. Existing customers were furious. Graphic designers who had spent $900 on Photoshop and expected to use it for 5 or 10 years were told they now had to pay $20 a month forever. Adobe didn't care. They had done the math. Under the old model, Adobe might sell a customer a new version every 3 years. That's $900 every 3 years, or $300 per year, or $25 per month in equivalent recurring revenue. Under the new model, customers paid $20 per month, but many customers who would have skipped versions or used old versions indefinitely were now forced to pay. And $20 per month is $240 per year. Adobe projected that they would make less per customer initially, but more over the long term, as customers who would have stopped buying stayed subscribed. They were right. Within 5 years, Adobe's revenue had nearly doubled, and their stock price had quadrupled. Wall Street loved the subscription model because it created predictable, recurring revenue. Instead of the volatility of product launches, Adobe had a steady stream of cash that grew automatically as they raised prices and added customers. In 2024, Adobe Creative Cloud costs about $60 per month for the full suite. That's $720 per year. Over 10 years, a user will pay Adobe $7,200 and own nothing. Microsoft followed the same path with Office 365. You can still buy Office as a one-time purchase, but Microsoft buries that option and makes the subscription vastly more attractive. For $10 per month per user, you get the latest version of Office, 1 terabyte of cloud storage, and various other features. For a family, that's $10 per month or $120 per year. Over 10 years, that's $1,200. The old model, you paid $300 once and used it for a decade. The new model, you pay $1,200 and own nothing. For companies, the benefits are overwhelming. Predictable revenue makes them more valuable to investors. No used market means every customer pays. No piracy means every user is monetized. Continuous updates mean they can add features and charge more without shipping a new product. Customer lock-in means switching costs are high and churn is low, and price increases can be implemented gradually, $1 or $2 per month without the sticker shock of a big version upgrade. But there's a darker element that companies don't advertise. Subscription software gives the company permanent power over you. They can change the terms at any time. They can raise prices, and you have 2 choices: pay or lose access to your work. They can add or remove features without your consent. They can change the interface, the functionality, or the performance, and you have no recourse. They can monitor your usage, harvest your data, and sell insights about your behavior to third parties. You have no privacy and no control. Even worse, they can shut you out entirely. If your credit card expires and you don't update it quickly enough, you lose access. If their payment processor flags your account for any reason, you lose access. If you live in a country they decide not to serve anymore, you lose access. If you violate their terms of service, which they can change unilaterally, you lose access. You are entirely dependent on their goodwill and their systems functioning correctly. You have no ownership rights, no due process, and no leverage. This power imbalance is the key. With the old model, once you bought software, the transaction was complete. The company had no ongoing power over you. They couldn't take it back. They couldn't demand more money. They couldn't spy on how you used it. The relationship was over. But with subscriptions, the relationship is never over. You are permanently entangled with the company. They have permanent power over you. You are not a customer. You are a dependent. The software industry proved that this model works and that customers would accept it, however reluctantly. Once that was proven, every other industry started looking for ways to apply the same logic. If you can turn a product into a service and extract monthly payments forever, why wouldn't you? The profit incentive is overwhelming, and so the subscription model metastasized from software into every corner of the economy. starting with the most important asset most people will ever buy, their home. Housing is the most important economic asset for most people. It's the largest purchase most people ever make, the primary source of wealth for middle-class families, and the foundation of economic security. The ability to buy a home, build equity, and eventually own it outright has been central to the American dream for generations. But that ability is rapidly disappearing, not by accident but by design, as homes are transformed from assets that individuals own into assets that corporations own and individuals rent forever. The numbers tell a stark story. In 1960, the median home price in the United States was $15,600. The median household income was $5,600. The price-to-income ratio was 2.8. A family making the median income could reasonably expect to buy a median-priced home with a down payment they could save in a few years and a mortgage they could afford. By 1980, the ratio had risen slightly to 3.1, still very affordable by historical standards. Then something changed. By 2000, the ratio was 4.0. By 2006, just before the financial crisis, it had spiked to 5.0. After the crisis, it dropped temporarily. But by 2020, it was back to 5.0. As of 2024, the median home price is approximately $400,000. The median household income is approximately $75,000. The price-to-income ratio is 5.3. Houses now cost more than 5 years of total household income, and that's before accounting for the down payment, closing costs, or the reality that most of that income is already committed to taxes, food, transportation, and other necessities. But the ratio alone understates the crisis. In 1960, a mortgage on a median-priced home at 4% interest required a monthly payment of about $75, roughly 13% of median gross income. Today, a mortgage on a $400,000 home at 7% interest requires a monthly payment of about $2,600, roughly 42% of median gross income. And that assumes you have the $80,000 down payment, which the median American household emphatically does not have. The result is predictable. Home ownership rates for young adults have collapsed. In 1980, approximately 52% of adults under 35 owned homes. Today, that figure is below 40% and falling. For Millennials and Gen Z, home ownership is increasingly impossible without substantial family wealth. If your parents can't give you a down payment, you're probably going to rent. And you're going to rent for a very long time, possibly forever. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because homes stopped being primarily shelter and became primarily investment vehicles. And once that transformation occurred, a new class of investors entered the market. Investors who could pay cash, close quickly, and outbid any individual trying to buy a place to live. These investors are private equity firms, real estate investment trusts, and other institutional players, and they are systematically buying up the single-family home market. Invitation Homes, a company owned by the Blackstone Group, is the largest single owner of single-family rental homes in America. They own over 80,000 houses. American Homes for Rent owns about 60,000. Progress Residential owns about 90,000. These are just the three biggest. Hundreds of smaller firms are doing the same thing. In some markets, particularly in the Sun Belt, institutional investors own 10 to 20% of all single-family homes. In specific neighborhoods, they own the majority. These companies have several advantages over individual buyers. First, they can pay cash, which sellers love because there's no financing contingency. Second, they can close fast, often in a week or two. Third, they can pay above asking price because they're not buying a home to live in. They're buying a cash flow stream, and they can model exactly how much rent they can extract over decades. Fourth, they're buying at scale, which gives them efficiencies that individuals don't have. They can hire property management companies, negotiate volume discounts on maintenance, and spread administrative costs across thousands of properties. The result is that when a house comes on the market, individual buyers are competing against corporations with billions of dollars in capital, algorithmic pricing models, and no emotional attachment to the idea of homeownership. The individual wants a place to live. The corporation wants a return on investment. The corporation wins. What does the corporation do with the house? They rent it. And because they own so much of the local market, they have pricing power. If you want to live in a particular neighborhood or school district, you have limited options, and many of them are owned by the same landlord. They can raise rents aggressively because where else are you going to go? The economist's model of perfect competition assumes many small landlords competing for tenants, which keeps rents low. But when a few large landlords own a large share of the market, they can coordinate prices and extract much higher rents. And extract. They do. Institutional landlords typically charge rents that are 10 to 30% higher than small landlords for comparable properties. They nickel and dime tenants with fees for everything: application fees, pet fees, trash fees, amenity fees, package acceptance fees. They raise rents annually at rates that far exceed inflation. They resist repairs and maintenance because it cuts into profits. They use algorithmic eviction models that file for eviction the moment rent is late, destroying tenants' credit and legal records. They are optimizing for profit, not for community or human dignity. From the tenant's perspective, this is a disaster. You're paying more in rent than you would for a mortgage on the same house, but you're building zero equity. Every dollar you pay is gone forever. It's not an investment. It's just consumption. You have no control over your housing costs. The landlord can raise rent every year, and if you can't pay, you're evicted. You can't modify the house. You can't paint, renovate, or personalize. It's not yours. You're just passing through. And when you're old and can no longer work, you'll still be paying rent with no asset to sell or borrow against. From the investor's perspective, this is a gold mine. They bought a house for $400,000. They rent it for $2,500 per month. That's $30,000 per year in gross rent. After property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and management fees, they might net $20,000 per year. That's a 5% cash return, which is decent. But the real money is in appreciation. If the house appreciates at just 3% per year, it'll be worth $500,000 in 10 years. They've made $100,000 in appreciation plus $200,000 in net rent over that decade. Their total return is $300,000 on a $400,000 investment, or 75% over 10 years. And they still own the house, which they can sell or continue renting. But it gets better for them. Because they're extracting rent from you. They're essentially making you pay their mortgage if they finance the purchase. You're building their equity. You're paying their property taxes. You're paying their insurance. You're paying their maintenance costs. And at the end, they own the house, and you own nothing. This is the definition of wealth extraction. They provide capital up front. You provide labor over time, and they capture all the value. This is not a free market. This is a rigged market. Institutional investors have access to capital at rates individual borrowers can never match. They have scale advantages. They have political influence. In many cities, they lobby for zoning restrictions that limit new construction, keeping supply tight and prices high. They benefit from tax structures that favor real estate investment. They exploit legal systems that favor landlords over tenants. The game is tilted in their favor at every level. The result is a fundamental transformation in the American housing market. We are moving from a nation of homeowners to a nation of renters, and the rentiers are corporations, not individuals. This is not a temporary blip. This is a structural shift. As long as housing is more profitable as an investment than as shelter, and as long as institutional investors have better access to capital than individuals, they will continue buying up housing stock and converting it to rentals. Homeownership will become the privilege of the wealthy, and everyone else will rent from corporate landlords forever. The psychological and political consequences of this are profound. Renters are transient. They don't invest in communities. They don't show up to city council meetings. They don't care as much about local schools or parks because they might not be there next year. They have less political power because they have less economic power. They can't vote with their feet as easily because moving costs money, and finding new rentals in expensive markets is difficult. They are, in a very real sense, subjects rather than citizens. They live in places they don't control, under terms they didn't negotiate, with no path to ownership or independence. And this is spreading beyond housing. The subscription model that transformed software and the rental model that is consuming housing are now being applied to every other asset class, starting with the cars we drive. Your car used to be simple. You bought it, you owned it, and everything in it worked because you paid for it. If the car had heated seats, those seats heated when you pressed the button. If it had cruise control, the cruise control worked. If it had a navigation system, you could use it. The manufacturer built the features into the car. You paid for them in the purchase price, and that was the end of the relationship. You could drive that car for 15 years if you maintained it well, and every feature would work for all 15 years. That model is dying. Car makers have realized they can install features in every car but lock them behind software paywalls. They can charge you a monthly subscription to use hardware that's already in your vehicle. And if you don't pay, the features simply don't work, even though the physical components are sitting right there, fully functional, just waiting for a software unlock code. BMW was the most brazen early example. In 2022, they announced that heated seats, a feature that costs the company perhaps $50 in hardware, would require a monthly subscription of $18. The seats were already installed. The heating elements were already wired, but BMW would disable them in software unless you paid the monthly fee. The backlash was swift and brutal. The internet erupted in mockery. Even mainstream media outlets called it absurd. BMW eventually backed down in most markets, but the fact that they tried it at all reveals where the industry wants to go. Toyota implemented a similar scheme for remote start. If you buy a new Toyota, you can start your car from your phone, which is a nice convenience on cold mornings. But that feature requires a subscription to Toyota's connected services, which costs $8 per month or $80 per year. The hardware is in the car, the software is installed, but Toyota artificially gates access unless you pay monthly. And here's the insidious part. They give you a free trial for a year or 3 years, depending on the model, getting you hooked on the convenience, and then they start charging. Many people just keep paying because canceling is a hassle, and they're used to the feature. Tesla has been doing this from the beginning. But because Tesla positioned itself as a tech company rather than a car company, people were more willing to accept it. Tesla sells various features as over-the-air software updates. Want better acceleration? That's $2,000 for the software unlock, even though your car already has the hardware capable of it. Want full self-driving capability? That's $15,000, and it's still in beta after years of promises. Tesla can also take features away. If you buy a used Tesla, features that the previous owner paid for might not transfer to you. Tesla remotely disables them, and you have to pay again to unlock what was already unlocked. But it's not just premium features. Basic functionality is becoming subscription-based. Many new cars require subscriptions for navigation. Even though GPS is free and your phone does it better, they require subscriptions for Wi-Fi hotspots, even though your phone can tether. They require subscriptions for premium audio, even though the speakers are already installed. They require subscriptions for maintenance reminders, diagnostics, and even detailed fuel economy tracking. Functions that used to be standard are now gated behind monthly fees. General Motors announced that they expect to generate $25 billion annually from software and subscriptions by 2030. $25 billion. That's not from selling cars. That's from charging people monthly fees to use features in cars they already bought. Ford, Stellantis, and every other major automaker have similar ambitions. The entire industry is pivoting to a model where the car sale is just the beginning, and the real money comes from years of subscription revenue. Why are they doing this? For the same reason software companies did it. Recurring revenue is more valuable than one-time sales. If Ford sells you a car for $40,000, that's one transaction. But if they can sell you the car for $40,000 and then extract $20 per month in subscription fees, that's $240 per year. If you keep the car for 10 years, that's an additional $2,400. And many cars now have multiple subscription options, so the total could be $5,000 or $10,000 over the car's lifetime. That's an enormous amount of additional revenue that previously didn't exist. But there's a more fundamental shift happening. Cars are becoming computers on wheels, filled with sensors, cameras, GPS, and internet connectivity. They generate massive amounts of data about where you go, how you drive, how fast you accelerate, how hard you brake, even what you say inside the car if voice assistants are enabled. This data is incredibly valuable. Insurance companies want it to price your insurance. Marketers want it to target you with ads. Law enforcement wants it for investigations. And the car companies want it to optimize their subscription offerings. The connected car enables total surveillance and total control. The manufacturer knows where you are at all times. They know if you're speeding. They know if you're driving erratically. They know if you go to places they or their partners might be interested in. They can monetize this data by selling it or using it to personalize offers. And they can use this data to enforce compliance. If you stop paying your subscription, they can remotely disable features. If you miss car payments, they can remotely disable the entire car. In some cases, they already do this. Right to repair laws, which would allow independent mechanics to service your car and access its diagnostic systems, are bitterly opposed by car makers. They want to force you to use dealerships for all service, which allows them to control pricing and extract more money over the vehicle's lifetime. They use proprietary software systems that independent mechanics can't access, and they void warranties if you dare to let anyone other than a certified dealer touch your car. They want you dependent on them for every aspect of vehicle ownership. The lease economy accelerates this trend. Car makers increasingly push leases over purchases because leases ensure a perpetual payment. You lease a car for 3 years, make monthly payments, and at the end you have to give it back and lease another one. You never build equity. You never own anything. You're a permanent renter, and the manufacturer loves it because you're a guaranteed repeat customer, generating recurring revenue. For consumers, this is a disaster. You're paying more for less. You're building no equity. You're under constant surveillance. You have no control over your own vehicle. Features can be disabled remotely. Prices can be raised unilaterally. You're dependent on the manufacturer's servers staying online, their software not having bugs, and their business not deciding to discontinue support for your model. And when you sell the car, many of the features you paid subscriptions for don't transfer, reducing the resale value. Cars used to be symbols of freedom. You bought a car, and you could go anywhere. It was yours. You controlled it. Now cars are becoming mobile subscription platforms, surveillance devices, and tools of corporate control. You don't own your car. You license access to it. And that access can be modified, monitored, or revoked at any time. The open road is closing, one subscription at a time. But even as our physical possessions are being converted to subscriptions, the most culturally significant transformation might be happening to our media, our books, our music, our movies, our games, everything we use to entertain ourselves, educate ourselves, and understand the world is being systematically taken from us and rented back as temporary access. A generation ago, you bought media, and it was yours forever. You bought a record, a cassette, or a CD, and you could listen to it 10,000 times over 50 years if you wanted. You bought a VHS tape or a DVD, and you could watch that movie whenever you wanted for the rest of your life. You bought a book, and it sat on your shelf until you passed it to your children. You built a media collection that was tangible, permanent, and truly yours. You could lend it to friends. You could sell it at a garage sale. You could pass it down as inheritance. It had material existence, and you had property rights over it. That world is gone. Today, you don't buy media. You license temporary access to it. You pay Netflix $15 a month to watch shows that might disappear next week. You pay Spotify $11 a month to listen to music that could be pulled from the platform tomorrow over a royalty dispute. You buy movies on iTunes or Amazon, but you don't actually buy them. You license them, and the license can be revoked. Amazon has deleted books from people's Kindles. Apple has removed movies from people's libraries. These weren't glitches. These were licensing agreements ending, and when they ended, your purchased content vanished. The shift started with music. Napster and file sharing convinced the music industry that their old business model was dying. CDs were being ripped and shared for free. The industry sued individuals and tried to use digital rights management to stop copying, but it was futile. People wanted digital music, and they wanted it cheap or free. Apple's iTunes Store, launched in 2003, offered a compromise. You could buy individual songs for 99 cents, which was much cheaper than buying a $15 CD for one song. It seemed like a good deal, and it stabilized the industry for a while. But streaming was always the end game. Spotify, launched in 2008, offered unlimited access to millions of songs for $10 per month. For anyone who bought more than 10 songs per month, this was an incredible deal. For 99 cents per song, 10 songs would cost almost $10. So if you listened to a lot of music, Spotify was far cheaper than buying. The value proposition was obvious, and millions of people subscribed. But here's what people didn't think about carefully enough. When you bought a song on iTunes, you owned that file. It was on your hard drive. You could back it up, transfer it to new devices, and keep it forever. When you subscribe to Spotify, you own nothing. You're renting access to Spotify's library, which Spotify doesn't even own. They license it from record labels, and those licenses can change. Songs disappear from Spotify constantly. Entire albums vanish. Artists remove their catalogs over disputes about royalties or principles, and you have zero control over any of it. Your $10 per month buys you this month's access to whatever Spotify currently has licenses for. Moreover, Spotify decides what you listen to. The algorithm recommends songs and creates playlists. Most people just listen to what Spotify suggests, rather than actively curating their own collection. This means your taste is being shaped by an algorithm optimized for engagement and for promoting whatever music Spotify has favorable licensing deals for. You're not discovering music organically. You're being fed music that serves Spotify's business model. Video followed the same path. Netflix started as DVD rentals, but pivoted to streaming in 2007 for $8 per month. Later raised repeatedly to now over $15 for the standard plan. You got unlimited access to their library, compared to cable TV at $60 or $80 per month. This was a revolutionary deal. Millions cut the cord and subscribed. But Netflix's library is entirely licensed. They don't own most of what they stream. They license it from studios and content owners, and those licenses expire. This means your favorite show can disappear at any time. Netflix regularly purges content as licenses end or become too expensive to renew. When Disney launched Disney Plus, they pulled all their content from Netflix. When Warner Media launched HBO Max, they did the same. The streaming wars fragmented the market into a dozen different services, each with exclusive content, each requiring a separate subscription. Now, if you want to watch everything you want to watch, you might need Netflix, Disney Plus, HBO Max, Amazon Prime Video, Apple TV Plus, Paramount Plus, Peacock, and Hulu. That's 8 services at roughly $15 each on average. which is $120 per month. You're paying more than cable ever cost, and you own none of it. Cancel your subscriptions, and you lose access to everything. You've spent thousands of dollars over the years and built no library. You have nothing. Books have followed the same trajectory. Kindle and other e-readers promised convenience. You could carry thousands of books in one device. You could buy books instantly and start reading immediately. But the books you buy on Kindle aren't really yours. Amazon's terms of service make clear that you're licensing the content, not buying it. Amazon can and has deleted books from people's Kindles, most famously when they removed copies of George Orwell's 1984 due to a rights issue. The irony was not lost on anyone. The most famous dystopian novel about totalitarian control was deleted remotely from people's devices without their consent. Physical books are permanent. They sit on your shelf. They don't require batteries or internet. They can't be deleted. They can be loaned, resold, or passed down. E-books are temporary. They exist at the pleasure of Amazon or Apple or whoever sold them to you. They're locked with DRM, so you can't transfer them or back them up effectively. If the company goes out of business or decides to exit the market, your entire library could vanish. You've built nothing. You've just rented access. Video games are the same story. You used to buy a game cartridge or disc and own it forever. Now most games are digital downloads tied to your account on Steam, PlayStation Network, or Xbox Live. If your account is banned, you lose access to every game you bought. If the platform shuts down, you lose everything. If the game requires online servers to function and the publisher shuts down those servers, the game becomes unplayable. Hundreds of games have already become unplayable because their servers were shut down. You paid full price for those games, and now they're worthless. The shift from ownership to access in media has several consequences. First, it eliminates the used market. You can't sell your Netflix subscription. You can't resell your Spotify access. You can't lend your Kindle book to a friend. This means every user must pay the platform directly, which increases revenue. Second, it eliminates permanence. Your media collection is temporary and revocable. You're always at risk of losing access. Third, it centralizes control. A small number of platforms control what media is available and how you access it. They decide what you can watch, read, or listen to based on their licensing deals and algorithmic priorities. Fourth, and most insidiously, it changes what media gets created. When artists were paid based on album sales, they created albums worth owning. When artists are paid fractions of a cent per stream, they create content optimized for algorithmic recommendation and repeat streaming. Music gets shorter, more formulaic, more calculated to keep you listening without being memorable enough that you'd seek it out intentionally. Television becomes binge-watch bait, designed to keep you subscribed, not to be watched once and remembered forever. Quality becomes secondary to engagement metrics. You used to build a media collection that reflected your taste, your history, your identity. Your bookshelf said something about who you were. Your record collection was a curated expression of your sensibility. Now you have subscriptions, and subscriptions don't say anything about you except that you have discretionary income and you like entertainment. You own nothing. You've built nothing. You're just renting access to a feed of content that someone else controls, and when you stop paying, it all disappears as if it never existed. The transformation of software, housing, cars, and media, from ownership to subscription, is not separate trends. It's one trend, driven by one logic: maximizing corporate revenue by converting customers into perpetual renters. But the full consequences of this transformation are not just financial. They're psychological, social, and generational. And most people haven't yet grasped how much damage is being done. When you rent something for a month, you pay a price. When you rent something for 10 years, you pay vastly more than you would have paid to buy it outright. When you rent something forever, you pay infinitely more. And at the end, you own nothing. This is the subscription tax, and it's one of the largest hidden transfers of wealth from individuals to corporations in modern history. Let's do the math. Adobe Photoshop used to cost $900 for a perpetual license. You could use it for 10 years and your total cost was $900, or $90 per year. Now, Adobe Creative Cloud costs about $60 per month, or $720 per year. Over 10 years, that's $7,200. You've paid 8 times more and you own nothing. If you used the old version for 15 years, which many professionals did, your cost was $60 per year. Now it's $720 per year, 12 times more expensive. Microsoft Office used to cost $300 for a perpetual license. Over 10 years, that's $30 per year. Now, Microsoft 365 costs $120 per year for a family subscription. Over 10 years, that's $1,200. You've paid 4 times more and you own nothing. And Microsoft keeps raising the price. It started at $70 per year, then $80, then $100, now $120. There's no reason to think it will stop. 10 years from now, it might be $200 per year. Spotify costs $11 per month, or $132 per year. Over 10 years, that's $1,320. In the old model, you might have bought 10 albums per year at $15 each, which is $150 per year, or $1,500 over 10 years. So Spotify saves you money if you listen to a lot of music. But you own nothing. Your collection has no value. You can't sell it. You can't pass it to your children. And if you stop paying, it all disappears instantly. Netflix started at $8 per month. Now it's over $15 per month for the standard plan, or $180 per year. Over 10 years, that's $1,800. You could have bought 90 DVDs for that money, and you'd own them forever. But instead, you rented access to a library that changes constantly, and you own nothing. Now add them all up. Adobe, $120 per month. Microsoft, $10 per month. Spotify, $11 per month. Netflix, $15 per month. Amazon Prime, $15 per month. Disney Plus, $14 per month. Your phone, $60 per month. Your internet, $70 per month. Cloud storage, $10 per month. Gym membership, $30 per month. Meal kit, $40 per month. Car subscription features, $20 per month. Streaming music, $10 per month. That's $435 per month, or $5,220 per year, or $52,200 over 10 years, or $156,600 over 30 years. And these prices increase every year. Netflix has raised prices over a dozen times. Spotify raised prices. Adobe raised prices. Microsoft raised prices. Amazon raised prices. Every subscription increases by 3 to 10% annually. Inflation is about 3% per year. But subscription price increases often exceed inflation. This means your subscription burden grows faster than your income. Every year, subscriptions eat a larger percentage of your paycheck. The opportunity cost is staggering. $5,200 per year is $5,200 that can't be invested. If you invested that money at a 7% annual return, after 30 years, you would have $529,000. But instead, you spent it on subscriptions and own nothing. You could have retired early or bought a house or started a business, but you paid subscriptions instead, and corporations captured that wealth. Subscriptions are also regressive. Poor people pay more because they can't afford upfront costs. If you have $900, you can buy Photoshop once and use it for years. If you don't have $900, you have to pay $60 per month forever. The same is true for cars. If you can afford to buy a car with cash, you pay the purchase price, and that's it. If you can't, you lease or finance, paying interest and fees that dramatically increase the total cost. If you can afford a house down payment, you build equity. If you can't, you rent and build nothing. Wealth enables you to avoid subscriptions. Poverty forces you into them, and subscriptions keep you poor by extracting wealth you could otherwise accumulate. The poverty trap is vicious. You're poor, so you rent everything. Renting prevents you from accumulating wealth. Without wealth, you can't afford to buy, so you keep renting. The subscription economy is a wealth extraction machine that ensures the poor stay poor and the middle class can't build wealth. Only the already wealthy can opt out by buying things outright and avoiding subscriptions. Everyone else is trapped, and the psychological impact compounds the economic damage. When every aspect of your life requires a monthly payment, you live in a state of permanent financial anxiety. You're always one missed payment away from losing access to essential tools, shelter, or services. You can't relax because the bills never end. You can't plan long-term because you don't know what your costs will be next year. Subscriptions create a treadmill of perpetual payment that never ends and only gets faster. There's also a dark pattern in cancellation. Companies make subscribing easy and canceling hard. One click to subscribe, but to cancel you have to call customer service during business hours and argue with a retention specialist trained to talk you out of it. Or you have to navigate through 5 menus to find the hidden cancel button. Or you subscribe through a bundle and can't cancel just one service without canceling the whole bundle. Or you're on an annual plan and forgot, so you're billed for another year before you remember to cancel. These aren't accidents. They're deliberate friction designed to maximize revenue by making it harder to leave than to stay. Companies also exploit inertia. They give you a free trial to get you hooked. They automatically enroll you in paid plans when trials end. They raise prices gradually, betting that most people won't notice a few extra dollars per month. And it works. Most people don't audit their subscriptions regularly. They just keep paying, month after month, year after year, for things they barely use or don't use at all. The average person pays for multiple subscriptions they've forgotten about. That's pure profit for the companies. The subscription tax is not just about money. It's about power. Every subscription gives a company ongoing power over you. They can change terms, they can raise prices, they can degrade service, they can shut you out, and you have limited recourse because switching costs are high and alternatives are often no better. You're locked in by habit, by integration with other tools, by the hassle of migrating. Your dependence is their leverage, and they exploit it ruthlessly. This is wealth extraction on a massive scale. Corporations are not providing new value. They're taking products that used to be sold as ownership and converting them to rentals. They're taking the same product and charging more for it over time by eliminating the option to buy. They're inserting themselves as permanent middlemen in transactions that didn't need middlemen, and they're capturing wealth that used to stay with individuals and families. This is not innovation. This is feudalism. But the damage goes deeper than just money. The shift from ownership to rental is changing human psychology in profound and disturbing ways. When you own nothing, you think differently. You plan differently. You relate to the world differently. Ownership creates a specific psychological orientation toward the future, toward place, toward things, and toward yourself. Renting creates a fundamentally different orientation, and the mass conversion from ownership to rental is creating a mass psychological transformation that we're only beginning to understand. Ownership creates security. When you own your home, you cannot be evicted as long as you pay property taxes. Your shelter is secure. You can plan your life around that security. You can invest in relationships in your neighborhood because you'll be there for years. You can invest in your home because improvements benefit you. You can take risks in your career because you have a foundation to fall back on. Your housing costs are predictable because your mortgage payment is fixed. You know what you'll pay each month for 30 years, and then you'll own it outright. This security creates psychological stability that enables long-term planning and investment. When you rent, you have no security. Your landlord can decline to renew your lease. They can raise your rent by an amount you can't afford. They can sell the property to a developer who demolishes it. You can be forced to move with relatively short notice, uprooting your life, your children's schools, your community ties. You don't know what your housing costs will be next year. You can't plan beyond your current lease. You can't take risks because you have no foundation. You're in a state of permanent precarity. Ownership creates investment. When you own your home, you improve it. You paint the walls, colors you like. You renovate the kitchen. You landscape the yard. You fix things that break because they're yours, and you'll benefit from the repair. You take pride in your property. It reflects your taste and effort. You're building something that will last and that you can pass to your children. This creates psychological engagement with your environment and a sense of agency and efficacy. You are shaping the world around you. When you rent, you don't invest. Why paint walls that aren't yours? Why renovate a kitchen that benefits your landlord? Why fix things beyond what the lease requires? You're just passing through. You minimize effort and attachment because you know you'll leave eventually. Your environment doesn't reflect you. It reflects someone else's choices, usually the cheapest possible finishes that meet code. You're living in a space designed for generic occupancy, not for you. This creates psychological disengagement and passivity. You're not shaping your environment. You're just occupying it temporarily. Ownership creates identity. My house, my car, my music collection, my tools. These possessions are extensions of yourself. They reflect your choices, your taste, your history. Your record collection tells the story of what you loved and when. Your bookshelf is a map of your intellectual journey. Your home is the physical manifestation of your life and family. Ownership allows you to curate a life that is distinctly yours. It gives you a sense of self that is embodied in the things you've chosen to buy and keep. When you rent, you have no identity anchored in possessions. You don't have a music collection. You have a Spotify account that looks like everyone else's. You don't have a bookshelf. You have a Kindle that could be wiped tomorrow. You don't have a home that reflects you. You have a rental that must be kept in its original condition. Your life becomes generic and interchangeable. You are not accumulating anything that tells your story. You are consuming content and occupying spaces, but you are not building a life that is uniquely yours. Ownership creates long-term orientation. When you buy a house, you're making a 30-year commitment. You're thinking about the next 3 decades. What will the neighborhood be like? What will the schools be like? What will your family need? You are forced to think long-term, and that thinking shapes your other decisions. You invest in your community because you'll be there. You care about local politics because they'll affect you for decades. You maintain relationships because you're not leaving. Long-term thinking creates stability and maturity. When you rent, you think short-term. Your lease is 1 year. You might move next year. You don't think about the neighborhood in 10 years because you won't be there. You don't care about local politics because they won't affect you long. You don't invest in relationships because you're transient. Short-term thinking creates instability and shallow engagement with life. You're always half gone, never fully present, never fully committed. Ownership creates agency. When you own something, you control it. You decide how to use it. You decide when to repair it. You decide whether to modify it. You decide whether to keep it or sell it. This control reinforces a sense of personal power and efficacy. You are the master of your domain. You make decisions and experience their consequences. This creates confidence and a sense that your actions matter. When you rent, you have no agency. The landlord decides what you can do. The subscription service decides what features you have access to. The platform decides what content is available. You are subject to terms set by others. You must ask permission for changes. You are constantly reminded that you are not in control, that your life is contingent on the decisions of corporations and landlords who don't know you and don't care about you. This creates learned helplessness and psychological submission. Ownership creates pride. When you own your home and maintain it well, you take pride in it. When you own your tools and use them skillfully, you take pride in your craft. When you own your creations, you take pride in your work. Pride is a psychological bulwark against despair. It gives you dignity. It gives you a reason to maintain standards and to strive for quality. It connects you to a tradition of ownership and stewardship that links past and future generations. When you rent, there is no pride of ownership. You're using someone else's things. You didn't build them. You won't keep them. They'll never be yours. There's nothing to be proud of. You're just a user, a consumer, a temporary occupant. This absence of pride creates a psychological emptiness, a sense that your life lacks substance and meaning. The cumulative psychological effect of a life without ownership is devastating. You live in permanent insecurity. You don't invest in anything. You have no identity anchored in possessions. You think short-term. You have no agency. You have no pride. You are psychologically transient in your own life, always renting, never owning, never building, never settling. You are, in a very real sense, homeless even if you have shelter. Because home is not just physical space. Home is a place you own, where you belong, where you have control and permanence. Rental is not home. It's just temporary shelter. And this psychological transformation has political consequences. People who own nothing are politically weak. They have no stake in society. They're transient and disengaged. They don't vote in local elections because they don't care about local issues. They don't organize because they don't have stable communities. They don't resist exploitation because they're too precarious to take risks. They are essentially politically passive subjects rather than active citizens. Historically, property ownership was a prerequisite for political participation, precisely because ownership creates psychological and economic independence. People who own property have something to lose and something to protect. They have incentives to participate in governance and to resist tyranny. But people who own nothing have no stake. They're dependent on others for survival, which means they can be controlled through threats to their access. They can't afford to resist. They can't afford to speak up. They're trapped in a system that extracts wealth from them, and they have no leverage to change it. This is not accidental. The erosion of ownership creates a population that is psychologically dependent, economically precarious, politically passive, and easy to control. And that population is more profitable for corporations because they pay rent forever without building wealth that might allow them to escape. The subscription economy is not just an economic model. It's a system of social control that creates a permanent underclass of renters who can never escape their dependence. The psychological transformation from owner to renter is one of the most significant and underappreciated consequences of the subscription economy. We are creating a generation of people who will never own homes, never build equity, never have security, and never have the psychological foundation that ownership provides. And we are doing this at precisely the moment when economic mobility is collapsing, inequality is exploding, and the middle class is disappearing. These trends are not coincidental. They are connected, and they are creating a new class structure that looks disturbingly like feudalism. The shift from ownership to subscription is not just changing how we pay for things. It is changing the structure of the economy itself. And that structure is concentrating wealth and power in ways that are systematically destroying the middle class. The middle class was never primarily defined by income. It was defined by asset ownership. A middle-class family owned a home, which appreciated over time and created wealth. They owned durable goods that lasted for years. They often had a pension, which was a form of guaranteed future income. They had savings. They had equity. They had assets that could be leveraged, sold, or passed down. Their wealth was not liquid, but it was real. They had something to fall back on in emergencies, something to borrow against for opportunities, and something to leave their children. Income alone doesn't create middle-class security. A family making $80,000 per year, but owning no assets, is not middle class in any meaningful sense. They're one emergency away from disaster. They have no equity, no leverage, no foundation. They're wealthy in income but poor in assets. And asset poverty is real poverty because it means no security and no generational momentum. The middle class was created by asset ownership, particularly homeownership. And as asset ownership is systematically eliminated, so is the middle class. The wealth gap is exploding precisely because of the shift from ownership to rental. People who own assets benefit from appreciation. Their homes increase in value. Their stocks increase in value. Their businesses grow. Their wealth compounds over time. But people who rent assets receive no appreciation. They pay rent, and that money is gone. They build no equity. They accumulate no assets. Over time, the gap between owners and renters grows exponentially. Consider two families in 1960. Family A buys a house for $15,000 with a mortgage. Family B rents a similar house for $100 per month. Both families have similar incomes and similar lifestyles. 30 years later, in 1990, Family A has paid off their mortgage and owns a house worth $150,000. They have $150,000 in equity that they can use for retirement. Family B has paid $36,000 in rent over those 30 years and owns nothing. The wealth gap between them is $150,000, created entirely by the decision to own versus rent. Fast forward to 2020. Family A's house is now worth $400,000. They've lived in it for 60 years, paid it off in 1990, and have had 30 years of essentially free housing, except for property taxes. They've accumulated enormous wealth. Family B has continued renting. They've paid over $500,000 in rent over 60 years, and they own nothing. The wealth gap is now $400,000, and Family B is facing retirement with no assets. This is the difference between ownership and rental over a lifetime. Now multiply this across an entire society. The generation that bought homes in the 1950s and 60s accumulated enormous wealth through appreciation. They passed this wealth to their children through inheritance or by helping with down payments. The generation that is renting today is accumulating no wealth. They will have nothing to pass to their children. The next generation will start from zero, just as their parents did. There will be no generational wealth accumulation. There will be no momentum. There will only be a permanent class of renters paying tribute to a permanent class of owners. This is not speculation. This is already happening. Millennials are the first generation in American history, poorer than their parents. Gen Z is likely to be poorer still. The primary reason is the collapse of homeownership. Previous generations bought homes, built equity, and passed wealth down. Current generations are renting, building no equity, and will have nothing to pass down. The wealth gap between generations is enormous and growing. The retirement crisis compounds this. Previous generations had three sources of retirement security: Social Security, employer pensions, and home equity. Social Security provides a baseline income. Pensions provided additional guaranteed income. Home equity provided a large asset that could be sold or borrowed against. Together, these three sources created a reasonably secure retirement for middle-class families. Today, pensions are nearly extinct. Most private sector jobs offer only 401k plans, which shift all investment risk to employees and provide no guaranteed income. Social Security is underfunded and likely to see benefit cuts. And for the generation that doesn't own homes, there will be no home equity. That means no secure retirement income, no guaranteed pension, and no asset to fall back on. The only source of retirement income will be whatever you manage to save in a 401k, and most people have saved nowhere near enough. The statistics are terrifying. The median retirement savings for Americans aged 55 to 64 is only $185,000. That might sound like a lot, but invested conservatively at 4% withdrawal rate, that generates $7,400 per year. Combined with Social Security at maybe $20,000 per year, that's about $28,000 total annual income in retirement. And that assumes you own your home and have no housing costs. If you're still renting, you might be paying $15,000 to $20,000 per year in rent, leaving you with less than $10,000 for everything else. That's poverty, and it gets worse. If you're renting in retirement and rents continue to increase faster than inflation, you're in a death spiral. Your fixed income doesn't keep pace with rising rents. You get pushed into cheaper and cheaper housing in worse and worse neighborhoods. Eventually, you may end up homeless. Elder homelessness is already skyrocketing in expensive cities, and it will get much worse as the generation that never owned homes reaches retirement age. The mobility freeze is another consequence. Without equity, you can't make big life changes. Want to move to a different city for a better job? You need a down payment for housing there. Don't have one? You're stuck. Want to start a business? You need capital or collateral for a loan. Don't have assets? You can't start. Want to go back to school? You need money or the ability to borrow. Don't have assets to borrow against. You can't do it. Asset ownership creates options and mobility. Asset poverty creates stagnation and trap. Previous generations could take risks because they had equity. They could borrow against their home to start a business. They could sell their home to relocate for opportunity. They had a foundation that enabled risk-taking and mobility. The current generation has no foundation. They're trapped in their current situations because they can't afford to change. Economic mobility requires literal mobility, and mobility requires capital, and capital requires assets. Without assets, there is no mobility. The result is a two-tier society. On one side, asset owners. These are people who own homes, stocks, businesses, and other appreciating assets. They collect rent, dividends, and capital gains. They build wealth passively through appreciation. They have security, options, and power. They can take risks, weather crises, and pass wealth to their children. They are, in effect, the new aristocracy. On the other side, renters. These are people who own no significant assets. They rent their housing, subscribe to software and services, lease their cars, and pay tribute to asset owners in the form of rent, interest, and fees. They build no wealth. They have no security. They have no options. They cannot take risks. They cannot weather crises. They have nothing to pass to their children. They are, in effect, the new peasantry. This is not capitalism. Capitalism assumes that people who work hard and save can accumulate capital and become capitalists themselves. It assumes class mobility. It assumes that the division between owners and workers is fluid and that workers can become owners through effort and thrift. But the subscription economy eliminates that possibility. When the only option is to rent, and when all income goes to rent and subscriptions, there is no way to accumulate capital. There is no class mobility. The division between owners and renters becomes permanent and hereditary. That's not capitalism. That's feudalism. The middle class was a historical anomaly made possible by widespread asset ownership. For a brief period in the mid-20th century, it was possible for regular people to own homes, build equity, retire with dignity, and pass wealth to their children. That period is ending. We are returning to a historical norm where a small elite owns everything and everyone else is dependent on them. The subscription economy is the mechanism of that return. It is the architecture of neo-feudalism. And neo-feudalism is not a metaphor. It is a precise description of the emerging economic structure. To understand where we're going, We need to understand where we've been. We need to understand what feudalism actually was and why the subscription economy is recreating its essential features. Feudalism was the dominant economic and social system in Europe from roughly the 9th century to the 15th century. At its core, feudalism was a system of property ownership and obligation. The king owned all land by divine right. He granted large estates to nobles in exchange for military service and loyalty. Nobles granted portions of their estates to knights in exchange for military service. Knights granted the right to work the land to peasants in exchange for labor and a share of the harvest. Everyone except the king was both a lord to someone below them and a vassal to someone above them. The key feature of feudalism was that almost no one owned land outright, except the very top of the hierarchy. Everyone else held land conditionally. Nobles held estates from the king as long as they provided military service. Knights held lands from nobles under the same terms. Peasants didn't hold land at all. They were tied to the land and obligated to work it, but they didn't own it. They paid rent to the lord in the form of labor, crops, and fees. They could not leave without permission. They had no legal recourse if the terms changed. They were legally and economically dependent on the lord. This system created a rigid class structure with almost no social mobility. You were born a peasant. You lived as a peasant. You died as a peasant, and your children were peasants. You were born a noble. You lived as a noble. You died as a noble, and your children were nobles. Wealth and status were hereditary. There was no way to rise through merit or effort because the system was built on inheritance and obligation, not on markets or opportunity. Peasants worked incredibly hard, but accumulated nothing. They farmed land they didn't own. They paid rent to lords who didn't work. The lords captured all the surplus value created by peasant labor. The lords lived in castles, ate well, had leisure time, and wielded political power. The peasants lived in hovels, struggled to survive, worked until they died, and had no power whatsoever. The system was fundamentally extractive. Wealth flowed up from peasants to lords, and there was no mechanism for it to flow back down. The parallels to the subscription economy are striking. In feudalism, the lord owned the land and the peasant paid rent. In the subscription economy, corporations own the assets, and you pay subscriptions. In feudalism, the peasant couldn't leave the land without permission. In the subscription economy, switching costs and platform lock-in make it prohibitively expensive to leave. In feudalism, the lord could change the terms unilaterally, and the peasant had no recourse. In the subscription economy, companies change prices and terms unilaterally in their terms of service, and you have no recourse. In feudalism, wealth was hereditary, and class mobility was almost impossible. In the subscription economy, wealth is increasingly hereditary, as homeownership becomes impossible without family wealth, and class mobility is collapsing as education costs explode, and good jobs require credentials that cost money. In feudalism, the peasant class worked hard, but accumulated nothing. In the subscription economy, renters work hard but build no equity and accumulate no assets. In feudalism, power was concentrated in the hands of landowners. In the subscription economy, power is concentrated in the hands of asset owners and platform controllers. The term techno-feudalism has been coined to describe this system. It's feudalism, but instead of land being the primary asset, it's platforms, software, intellectual property, and data. The lords are not dukes and earls, they're corporations and tech billionaires. But the fundamental power dynamic is the same. The small elite owns the critical assets. Everyone else pays them rent to access those assets. The elite captures the surplus value created by everyone else's labor and creativity. And there's no way out, because ownership is no longer an option. Consider the tech platforms. Google controls search and digital advertising. If you want to reach customers online, you pay Google. Facebook controls social networking. If you want to reach people socially, you pay Facebook. Amazon controls e-commerce. If you want to sell products online, you pay Amazon 30 to 40% of each sale, plus fees. Apple controls the iOS app ecosystem. If you want to reach iPhone users, you pay Apple a 30% cut of all revenue. Microsoft controls productivity software. If you want to work, you pay Microsoft monthly. Adobe controls creative software. If you want to create, you pay Adobe monthly. These platforms are the digital equivalent of feudal estates. They own the land, which in this case is the infrastructure and user base. If you want to operate on their land, you pay rent in the form of fees, subscriptions, and data. You don't own your position on the platform. You're not a peer. You're a tenant. And the platform owner can change the rules at any time. They can raise fees. They can change algorithms to reduce your visibility. They can ban you entirely. You have no property rights and no recourse. You are entirely dependent on their goodwill. Even worse, you're not just paying money, you're paying in data. Every action you take on these platforms generates data. That data is harvested, analyzed, and used to manipulate you into spending more money, viewing more ads, and staying on the platform longer. Your data is sold to advertisers and other third parties. You're not just renting access, you're also the product being sold. This is a level of exploitation that feudal peasants never experienced. At least they kept their own thoughts private. The corporate sovereignty is complete. These corporations are larger and more powerful than most nations. Apple has a market capitalization over $3 trillion, which is larger than the GDP of all but a handful of countries. Amazon controls essential infrastructure for half the internet through AWS. Google controls access to information for billions of people. These companies don't just participate in the economy. They are the economy. They don't just follow laws. They lobby to write laws. They don't answer to governments. Governments struggle to regulate them. They operate as sovereigns. They set the rules in their domains. They have their own legal systems, called terms of service, which you must agree to in order to use their services. They have their own enforcement mechanisms. They can ban you, suspend you, demonetize you, or delete your account without trial, without appeal, without explanation. They control what you can say, what you can see, what you can buy, and what you can do within their platforms. This is governance, not just business. And you can't leave. Network effects and switching costs create lock-in that's nearly impossible to escape. If everyone you know is on Facebook, you can't leave Facebook without losing access to your social network. If your business depends on Google search ranking, you can't leave Google. If your work is in Adobe files, you can't leave Adobe without converting thousands of files and relearning new tools. If your customers are on Amazon, you can't leave Amazon without losing most of your market. The platforms have you trapped. This is feudalism. The platforms are the lords. You are the peasant. You pay rent to use their infrastructure. You have no ownership. You have no rights. You can't leave. They control you, and they extract wealth from you permanently. The only difference from medieval feudalism is that it's digital, it's global, and it's far more efficient at extraction. The endgame is clear. If these trends continue unchecked, we are headed toward a society where a tiny elite owns all assets, all platforms, and all infrastructure, and everyone else rents access to survival from them. Homeownership will be a privilege of the wealthy. Everyone else will rent from corporate landlords. Software, media, and digital tools will all be subscription only. Cars will be service platforms requiring monthly payments to use features. Even basic appliances will require subscriptions. Every aspect of life will involve paying rent to someone who owns the thing you need. This is not a future to look forward to. This is a dystopia, and it's not hypothetical. It's already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet, but it's spreading fast, and unless something changes, it will be universal within a generation. The question is whether we accept this future or whether we resist it. And if we resist, what does that resistance look like? The future we're building is not secret. The people building it have written about it, spoken about it at conferences, and published white papers describing it. The World Economic Forum, an organization of global business and political elites, has explicitly predicted that by 2030, you will own nothing and be happy. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's a stated vision. The phrase comes from a 2016 video and article produced by the World Economic Forum imagining life in 2030. The article describes a future where ownership has been replaced by borrowing and sharing. You don't own a car. You summon one when you need it. You don't own a home. You rent flexible living spaces based on your needs. You don't own clothes. You rent them or borrow them. You don't own anything. Everything is a service. And according to the World Economic Forum, this is progress. This is the future we should embrace. The justification is sustainability and efficiency. Ownership is wasteful, they argue. Cars sit unused 90% of the time. Homes have empty rooms. Clothes are worn a few times and discarded. If we shared everything instead of owning, we could reduce consumption, reduce waste, and reduce environmental impact. The sharing economy, they claim, is better for everyone and better for the planet. But the article is chillingly vague about who owns the things that you're renting and sharing. It doesn't say that no one owns anything. It says you will own nothing. Someone owns the cars you summon. Someone owns the living spaces you rent. Someone owns the clothes you borrow. The ownership hasn't disappeared. It's been consolidated. And the owners are not you. They're corporations and platforms that control access and extract rent. The stated goal is not to eliminate ownership. It's to eliminate your ownership. The goal is to concentrate ownership in the hands of a few and convert everyone else into permanent renters. And this is being sold as liberation. You'll be free from the burden of ownership, free from maintenance, free from responsibility. But what you'll actually be is free from independence, free from security, and free from power. You'll be dependent on corporate landlords for every aspect of your existence. Silicon Valley has been even more explicit. Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, has spoken about a future where software eats the world and everything becomes a digital service. Uber turned car ownership into a service. Airbnb turned homeownership into a service. Rent the Runway turned clothing ownership into a service. The vision is to do this for everything. Every object becomes a service. Every service requires a subscription. Every subscription generates data. Every data point enables more targeted extraction. It's a closed loop of surveillance and rent extraction. The technology exists to make this vision real. Internet of Things devices can make any physical object into a connected device that requires software to function. A toaster doesn't need internet connectivity, but if you add a chip and an app, you can require a subscription to use it. A washing machine doesn't need remote diagnostics, but if you add connectivity, you can charge monthly fees for premium wash cycles. A thermostat doesn't need machine learning, but if you add it, you can lock features behind a paywall. Any physical object can be turned into a subscription service. The business model is irresistible. Instead of selling a product once, you sell access to it forever. Instead of competing on quality and price, you lock customers in and extract rent. Instead of innovation driving new sales, you just raise prices on existing customers who can't leave. It's the perfect business model from the perspective of corporations. It's also the perfect business model for creating dependent, powerless consumers who can't escape. The dystopian scenario is not hard to imagine because we're already partially living it. You wake up in a rented apartment owned by a private equity firm. Your rent has increased 6% this year, and you have no recourse. You get dressed in clothes you're renting from a subscription service because buying clothes is expensive, and your closet space is limited in your small apartment. You get into a car you lease because buying is unaffordable, and your leased car requires a subscription to use the heated seats and the navigation system. You drive to a job where you use software you don't own. Microsoft 365 for productivity, Adobe for creative work, Salesforce for customer management, Slack for communication, Zoom for meetings. Every tool requires a subscription that your employer pays. And if you leave your job, you lose access to your own work. You spend your day creating value that your employer captures, using tools that Microsoft and Adobe capture rent, on platforms that Amazon and Google capture rent on. Value flows up at every level, and you capture none of it. You drive home, and your smart home requires subscriptions. Your security system, $10 per month. Your doorbell camera, $5 per month. Your thermostat's advanced features, $8 per month. Your coffee maker's premium modes, $6 per month. You pay for internet, $70 per month. To connect all these devices, you pay for cloud storage, $10 per month, to store your photos, because your devices don't have enough local storage. You pay for streaming services, $50 per month combined, to watch shows that might disappear tomorrow. You want to exercise, but your treadmill requires a subscription to unlock the workout programs. You want to cook, but the recipes you used to own in cookbooks are now in an app that requires a subscription. You want to read, but your books are on a Kindle, and your subscription to Kindle Unlimited just expired. Everything in your life requires payment, and none of it is yours. You are renting your entire existence from corporations that can change terms or cut you off at any time. The social credit scenario is not far-fetched. China already has a social credit system that monitors behavior and restricts access to services based on compliance. Travel, education, employment, and access to technology can all be restricted for people with low social credit scores. Now imagine that system combined with the subscription economy. Your access to housing, transportation, communication, and entertainment all require subscriptions from a handful of corporations. Those corporations cooperate with government or have their own interest in controlling behavior. If you violate terms of service, you lose access. If your social credit score drops, you lose access. If you can't pay, you lose access. If you criticize the system, you lose access. You become unpersoned, unable to function in society because all of society requires subscriptions you can't get. This is control beyond anything historical tyrants could have dreamed of. It's not physical imprisonment, it's digital exile, and it's far more efficient. The logical endpoint of the subscription economy is total dependence. You own nothing. You have no equity. You have no leverage. You cannot leave. You cannot resist. You are entirely at the mercy of corporations that control your access to housing, transportation, communication, entertainment, and work. They can monitor everything you do. They can change prices. They can change terms. They can exclude you. And you can do nothing about it because you have no alternatives and no power. This is neo-feudalism in its purest form. A small elite of asset owners and platform controllers who have total power over everyone else. A large population of renters and subscribers who have no power and no path to ownership. A system that extracts wealth from the many and concentrates it in the hands of the few. A world where freedom is dead and servitude is universal, and all of it hidden behind the language of innovation, convenience, and progress. So why hasn't this been stopped? Why have governments allowed corporations to systematically dismantle ownership and concentrate power? The answer is regulatory failure, driven by complexity, lobbying, and the global nature of these corporations. Regulatory systems were designed for a different era. They were built to regulate manufacturers, retailers, and service providers in industries with clear boundaries. But tech platforms don't fit into these categories. Is Google a media company or a tech company? Is Amazon a retailer or a logistics company? Is Uber a transportation company or a software company? The definitional ambiguity allows these companies to evade regulation by claiming they're not subject to the laws that govern similar businesses. Lobbying power is enormous. Tech companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars annually on lobbying and political contributions. They hire former regulators and legislators. They fund think tanks and academic research. They shape the terms of debate. They convince policymakers that regulating them would stifle innovation, harm consumers, and damage the economy. And they're often successful because legislators don't understand the technology and don't understand the long-term implications. The global nature of these corporations makes regulation nearly impossible. They're headquartered in one country, but operate globally. They can move profits to tax havens. They can move data to jurisdictions with weak privacy laws. They can threaten to leave markets if regulations are too strict. National governments struggle to regulate entities that are more powerful than they are, and that can escape jurisdiction by simply moving operations. Even when regulations are passed, enforcement is weak. The fines for violations are often trivial compared to the profits extracted. Facebook has been fined billions for privacy violations, but it hasn't changed their business model because the fines are just a cost of doing business. The incentive to violate remains strong because the profits vastly exceed the penalties. Moreover, many policymakers and regulators have been captured by the ideology that these companies promote. The belief that markets are efficient, that innovation should not be impeded, that consumer choice is paramount, and that government intervention is harmful. This ideology prevents aggressive regulation even when the harms are obvious. Regulators are reluctant to act because they've been convinced that the market will self-correct, even when it's clear that market concentration and lock-in effects prevent self-correction. The result is that the subscription economy and the concentration of ownership have proceeded essentially unchecked. There are some efforts to push back. The European Union has been more aggressive about privacy regulation with GDPR and about antitrust enforcement. Some states have passed right-to-repair laws. Some cities have imposed rent control and tenant protections. But these are minor and fragmented efforts against a global tide. They're not stopping the transformation. They're just slightly slowing it in a few jurisdictions. But resistance is not futile. There are movements, ideas, and actions that point toward an alternative future. The question is whether they can grow fast enough and become powerful enough to reverse the tide before ownership is eliminated entirely. The right-to-repair movement is one form of resistance. Activists and legislators are pushing for laws that require manufacturers to provide repair manuals, diagnostic tools, and spare parts so that consumers and independent repair shops can fix devices instead of being forced to replace them or use expensive authorized repair services. This challenges the manufacturer's control and extends the useful life of products. Several states have passed right-to-repair laws, and there's federal legislation being debated. Housing activists are fighting back against corporate landlords and unaffordable housing. They're advocating for rent control, tenant protections, and public housing. They're pushing for zoning reform to allow more construction. They're organizing tenant unions to collectively bargain with landlords. They're calling for taxes on vacant properties and on large institutional landlords. Some cities have implemented policies that make it harder for investors to buy up housing stock. It's a growing movement with real political power in some areas. The digital ownership movement is fighting for the right to truly own digital goods. They argue that if you buy a movie or a book or a game, you should actually own it, not just license it. They advocate for DRM-free media, for laws that prevent companies from deleting purchased content, and for interoperability standards that prevent lock-in. Some platforms like GOG sell DRM-free games that you actually own. Some artists release music without DRM. It's a small movement, but it's principled. Decentralization technologies like blockchain and cryptocurrency are attempts to create ownership systems that don't rely on centralized corporations. The idea is that if assets are recorded on a distributed ledger, No single entity can control or revoke them. You can truly own a digital asset because ownership is cryptographically secured and not dependent on a company maintaining a server. This is speculative and the technology has problems, but it represents an attempt to rebuild ownership in a digital age. Some people are opting out individually. They're prioritizing buying over subscribing where possible. They're buying physical media instead of streaming. They're buying houses, even if it requires sacrifice. They're using open source software instead of subscriptions. They're voting with their wallets for business models that respect ownership. This is a valid personal strategy, but it's not a systemic solution. Individual choice can't overcome structural forces. The ultimate solution has to be political. We need laws that protect ownership rights. We need antitrust enforcement that breaks up monopolistic platforms. We need housing policies that prioritize homeownership for residents over investment returns for corporations. We need tax structures that favor long-term ownership over short-term rental. We need a political movement that recognizes that the transition from ownership to rental is not just an economic shift. It's a shift in power from individuals to corporations, from citizens to subjects, from freedom to dependence. The question is whether such a movement can be built. The obstacles are enormous. The corporations benefiting from the status quo have immense wealth and power. They control media, shape narratives, and influence politics. The people harmed by the subscription economy are fragmented, distracted, and often don't fully understand what's happening to them. They see individual problems like high rent or expensive software, but they don't see the systemic pattern. They don't see that they're being transformed from owners into serfs. But history shows that even entrenched systems can be challenged and changed when enough people recognize the injustice and organize to fight it. Feudalism itself was eventually overthrown. The labor movement won rights for workers against powerful industrialists. Civil rights movements challenged and defeated legal segregation. These victories were not inevitable. They required decades of organizing, sacrifice, and struggle. But they happened. The battle over ownership is the defining economic struggle of the 21st century. It will determine whether we live in a society where people can build wealth, have security, and exercise independence, or whether we live in a neo-feudal dystopia where a small elite owns everything and everyone else is a permanent renter with no power and no hope. The outcome is not predetermined. It depends on whether people recognize what's happening and decide to fight back. The choice is yours. You can accept the subscription serfdom that corporations are building. You can pay rent on your life forever, own nothing, build no equity, have no security, and pass nothing to your children. You can become psychologically and economically dependent on corporations that don't care about you and that will extract every dollar they can from you. You can watch the middle class disappear and inequality explode while telling yourself that at least streaming is convenient. Or you can resist. You can prioritize ownership where possible. You can support policies that protect ownership rights. You can vote for candidates who will regulate corporate power. You can join movements fighting for housing justice, right to repair, and digital ownership. You can educate others about what's happening. You can refuse to accept that this is inevitable or that this is progress. The subscription economy is not the result of natural market forces or technological inevitability. It's the result of deliberate choices by corporations to maximize their power and profits at the expense of everyone else. And choices can be challenged, systems can be changed, power can be contested, but only if people decide to act.